Happy Independence Day, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Terminator Resistance for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a single-player only first-person shooter developed by Teon and published by Reef Entertainment in November of last year, and it's generally gotten a fairly mixed reception. A lot of critics didn't really seem to think much of it at all, while the reaction from the actual player base has generally been a bit more positive. And in fact, that's actually pretty surprising given that Teon are responsible for the Rambo video game, which was an awful rail shooter, which they actually do make fun of a bit in the dialogue of this game. One character eventually says he's a man, not a god, which is one of the lines that was very meme-worthy in the Rambo game. But regardless of how self-aware the developers were, what ultimately matters here is the actual quality of the game, because Terminator hasn't really had a good game in a very long time. In fact, the last one I played that I remember thinking was actually pretty decent was Terminator Future Shock, which I only ever had the demo of, unfortunately. And as I understand it, the sequel to that, Skynet, both included Future Shock and was just a better game in general, so that wasn't that long after Future Shock, and that means we haven't had a good Terminator game since the 90s, at least not that I've seen. Hell, while I'm thinking about it, we haven't had a good Terminator film since T2 Judgment Day. And it's kind of funny to think about just how terrible the movies were after Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines that, looking back on Terminator 3, we're like, you know what, that actually wasn't that bad. But I digress. The real question here is whether or not Teon managed to learn from their mistakes in Rambo the video game and made their second major licensed property like this a lot better, or if this just ends up being yet another game in the sea of movie licensed video games that is downright trash. Well, let's go ahead and delve right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which does run on the Unreal Engine, although it doesn't take as much advantage of that engine as you might hope, because it looks like something that either could have come out at the tail end of last generation, that of course being the PS3, Xbox 360 era, or the early parts of the Xbox One and PS4 generation. And that's even down to the washed out, mostly brown and gray color palette, although thankfully it's not the brown and gray and realistic we've come to hate from that particular era. It's more of an appropriate sort of brown and gray, considering of course the source material that it's going off of and the fact that it is post-apocalyptic, so there's not really going to be a whole lot of greenery or bright colors or anything like that. The thing is, they make a mistake in this regard because they eventually let you get somewhere that isn't just the urban hellscape that you're used to from the Terminator films, and you end up going off into a more rural area that does have forests and greenery, and its colors are all washed out and frankly quite ugly as well. That's not to say that there aren't bursts of color here and there, most notably with regards to the various plasma weaponry sending bolts of red and violet streaking through the air, but for the most part it's a very washed out, very bland, very boring color scheme that, while admittedly appropriate for the source material and setting, certainly doesn't do the visuals any favors when it's combined with the actual visual quality, which again is a bit dated at this point. The modeling is mostly fine, but the texture quality is not particularly good, and more importantly, the animations are a bit sluggish and awkward. The weapon handling animations are pretty weak, which means that most of the weapons themselves feel like they don't have a whole lot of weight or punch behind them, which to some degree is appropriate. I mean, the energy weapons probably wouldn't have much kick behind them, although we don't have any real plasma weaponry to compare it to, so who knows there. But this is most glaring an issue before you gain access to all the plasma weaponry and you're stuck with the conventional weapons like, say, an M16 or a shotgun, and even the animations for those are pretty wimpy. Moving on from the weapon animations, the actual character animations range from rather good in the case of all of the machines, which are animated to fairly meticulous detail in fact, down to the rather mediocre in the case of most of the character animations, which certainly get the job done and they don't look outright bad, but they're not particularly impressive either, to the relatively weak in the case of the lip sync, which looks positively last gen, and finally to the downright awkward in the case of the sex scenes. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to sex scenes in video games if they're done well, but the ones in Terminator Resistance are not done well, and they end up being neither interesting, nor exciting, nor even so bad they're funny, like in the case of something like Ride to Hell Retribution. I'm not really sure what they were actually going for with them, but between the last gen visuals and the having rather clunky animations, they just end up being rather weird and awkward, and considering they don't even really show anything, they frankly could have accomplished the same thing with a fade to black. So the visuals don't really do anything to impress the player and end up being on the weaker side, but what about the sound design? Well, in some instances they've done quite a good job. I mean, all of the machines sound pretty much exactly like you would expect them to after having seen the movies, which is definitely great attention to detail. And the same is true for all of the plasma weaponry, but once you go beyond those elements, you start to run into problems. The weapon sounds, apart from the plasma, are generally on the weaker side, and some of them sound downright stock. The explosions do fare a bit better in that regard, but even those don't really have a whole lot of punch behind them, so everything ends up feeling relatively weak, even if it does do quite a bit of damage. Then you move over into voice acting, and while it is decent, it's definitely nothing to write home about either. The characters are voiced competently, but not particularly impressive in any regard, and you end up not really being able to get very attached to any of the characters as a result. Finally, you have the music, which does have a very good rendition of the classic Terminator theme, but apart from that, most of the soundtrack is very repetitive, very short loops that just end up being completely forgettable. So when you bring all the presentation together, it is a very mixed bag. It's not outright bad, but nor is it particularly good in any one regard or even as a whole. Which of course brings us to what really matter here and what could ultimately salvage the entire experience, which are the story and the gameplay. Now before I start talking about the story, I need to mention that I'm not really going to go over any of the events that are covered in the films. If you want to know about those, go watch Terminator and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. They are both fantastic films, and if you don't like them, there's probably something wrong with you. Although, to be fair, I am very biased in that regard in case you can't tell from my name. Anyway, the point is that I'm assuming you are familiar with the events of Terminator and Terminator 2 Judgment Day with regards to discussing the story of Terminator Resistance. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Well, it takes place about 30 years after Judgment Day during the Future War, and you play as Private Jacob Rivers, who is a member of the Resistance in the Pacific Division, which is completely wiped out by an infiltrator unit. With Rivers being the only survivor, he starts making his way south in order to meet up with the rest of the Resistance and end up taking the fight back to Skynet, and he ends up in Pasadena as it gets overrun by the machines and hooks up with a small band of surviving civilians, and together they flee the machines until eventually their bus breaks down and they have to make a temporary base where Rivers will ultimately link up with the main part of the Resistance and encounter that infiltrator unit again, only to escape its clutches with the help of a mysterious stranger who will occasionally help Rivers throughout the entire course of the story. It's at this point that Rivers finds out he has been marked for termination, and in trying to figure out exactly what that means, he ends up helping the Resistance with their fight against Skynet, helps to take down the infiltrator unit, and ultimately takes part in the final major offensive against Skynet itself in order to end things once and for all. Along the way, Rivers will interact with a variety of characters, mostly that group of survivors that he encounters at the beginning of the game, and as he continues to talk with them and learn more about them, he will improve his relationship with them, and based on certain choices that he makes, certain elements of the story might be different later on down the line. And with two of the characters he's interacting with, there's even the option for romance. But while it is nice they've included an element of choice and consequence in the story, it ultimately ends up being a rather weak storyline overall that relies very heavily on its license more than the actual writing, and once you get further on into the story and more things are revealed, that becomes pretty painfully obvious. And the characters don't really do a whole lot to help prop things up either. I mean, Rivers himself barely has a personality at all, and the rest of the characters you interact with certainly have some degree of personality, but they mostly just end up falling into certain archetypes and not really straying from that. All of that put together means that the writing is on the weaker side of things, but it's not that much of a detriment to the game as long as the gameplay is enough to carry it. So what exactly do you get with the gameplay in Terminator Resistance? Well, it's a first-person shooter that is in a lot of ways a pretty generic modern action game. There's stealth, there's combat, there's some light scavenging and crafting mechanics, there's a leveling system where you will unlock perks over time, it has a lockpicking minigame that is lifted directly out of Bethesda's Fallout games, while the hacking minigame is basically the same as the one from from Mass Effect, only it takes place only on a horizontal plane, and there's a bunch of obstacles in the way, as well as the various moving blocks that you have to avoid. And there's even some light inventory management you're going to have to do. The thing is, apart from the lockpicking and hacking minigames, as well as the leveling system, basically all of that fits perfectly in a Terminator game. And that would actually be fine if it weren't for the fact that we've had so many games recently that follow that same basic formula and are just different interpretations of the action part. And like a lot of those games, this has relatively open-ended levels where you'll go into an area and you'll have multiple objectives you can complete in any order you want, some of which are side objectives, some of which are main objectives, and you'll usually be able to attack them from multiple angles, although those angles are going to generally just be either sneaking around or going in guns blazing. And if you decide to go in guns blazing, you find out very quickly that that's probably a terrible idea, at least until you've gotten through the entire upgrade tree and have access to the violet plasma weaponry. You see, in case you've forgotten, Terminators are machines. Ultimately, even the infiltrator units are machines. They're cyborgs, but they're still machines underneath all that, which means that they are extremely resilient. How is that interpreted in this game? Well, the drones don't take all that much to bring down, but pretty much everything else is an absolute bullet sponge, and once you start encountering the Terminators themselves, you find out very quickly that the only conventional weapon that has any effect on them at all is the shotgun, and all that does is knock them over. The only weapons that will do damage against them are explosives, which thankfully continue to do damage to them throughout the entire game, and plasma weaponry, which you don't get until a bit later on. It's not that far into the game that you gain access to them, but there is a period where you're going to have to be either avoiding the Terminators outright, or just knocking them over and trying to get away from them, or you're going to have to hack turrets in order to be able to use those to take them out. This means that once you gain access to plasma weaponry, you're probably going to ditch the conventional weapons unless you're just using them to take out the drones or to take out the silverfish, which do still go down to those. But enemies are still damage sponges even with the plasma weaponry. Sure, it'll do more damage to the enemies you were already able to take out, and you'll also be able to actually do damage to Terminators for a change, but the amount of punishment that enemies can take is extremely high, and until you finally gain access to violet plasma weaponry at the end of the game, you're going to find that most of your weapons feel extremely weak. Now again, to some degree that makes sense. I mean, they confirm in the movies that even with the plasma weaponry that they have access to in the future war, Terminators are still extremely dangerous and hard to take down. But as tough as the Terminators themselves are, there are things even tougher than them, like the HK units or the T-47, which can take a ludicrous amount of damage to bring down, and in the case of the HK units, they're especially dangerous because they can only take damage from explosive weapons until you finally get to the end of the game and unlock the violet plasma weaponry. Now you will occasionally notice a message on the screen saying critical hit, and that's when you actually hit one of the weak points on a particular enemy, which is usually its head or its sensor array or something along those lines, and it will do extra damage to them, but even if you're hitting those points, the enemies can still take a very high amount of damage before they finally go down. Again, thematically, that makes sense. It makes sense given everything we've seen from the Terminator films. But what works thematically doesn't always work for the actual mechanics, and when you go into the combat scenarios in this, it means that all of your weapons feel extremely weak and you are constantly at a disadvantage until you finally gain access to the endgame weapons. And by the time you get access to the endgame weapons, you barely have time to use them before the game's over. And matters aren't helped by the leveling system, which allows you to gain upgrades over time by earning experience points and gradually leveling up, and those skill points can be put into various perks that will give you passive bonuses like additional damage resistance or additional damage with your various weapons, or even just be able to use certain weapons in the first place, like the Skynet plasma weaponry. And most of that is even gated behind arbitrary leveling requirements, so you'll have to be certain levels to be able to unlock certain perks. I mean, to give you a prime example, the first plasma weapons you'll gain access to are these Skynet plasma guns, but you're not going to be able to use them because they require a certain perk that has an arbitrary level requirement on it, and thus they'll just end up taking up inventory space until you finally get access to that perk, and by the time you do have access to it, you've already got access to resistance plasma weaponry anyway. In fact, the same thing happens once Skynet gains access to violet plasma weaponry, and you're able to pick up violet plasma rifles from the fallen Terminators, and you can't use them because you don't have the perk, and you haven't hit the arbitrary level required to get that perk. Now you may be thinking to yourself, but DW, that's what the side objectives are for, right? Well, to some degree. I finished every single objective in the game, side and main, and it still didn't level me up enough to gain access to the Skynet plasma weaponry before I gained access to the resistance plasma weaponry. So that's just the way the developers pace the game, unfortunately. So when you bring all of that together, that whole guns blazing thing I mentioned is actually a terrible idea until you get to the very end of the game, and even by that point, there are still a couple of things getting in the way of just going in guns blazing, and those are the fact that even with your toughness maxed out, which is all of the health-based unlocks, you still can barely take any damage before going down, even on the normal difficulty, and much more importantly, the enemies are pinpoint accurate even from long range and can hit you with a lot of damage really quickly. Again, thematically this makes a whole lot of sense. For one, humans are really squishy, so we can't really take a lot of real damage, and the more salient point here is that the enemies you're fighting are machines. Of course they're going to be extremely accurate. But like I said earlier, what makes sense thematically doesn't always work mechanically, and what this results in with the combat loop in Terminator Resistance is a whole lot of frustration as you try to pull off hit and run tactics that just don't work all that well because the enemy can hit you with a few shots that take you down from max health to almost nothing in the span of less than a second. And since health doesn't automatically regenerate until you've maxed out the toughness tree, you're going to be relying on medikits to heal yourself up, and the basic medikits barely heal anything, while the more expensive, much harder to produce second tier medikits will heal you back up to basically full. But of course, medikits are relatively rare when you're wandering around the various levels and exploring, and they are difficult to produce because the components required for them are in relatively short supply, and they're expensive if you go to trade for them, so you're probably going to be short on medikits for most of the game, especially if you're playing on a higher difficulty. Of course, that's assuming you even have them equipped in the right slot, because you actually have to equip medkits to your defensive item slot and then use them to be able to get any benefit out of them, and whenever you use an item, it actually has to go through an animation where you pull the item out and use it. And unless you've got something between you and the enemy that is absorbing the damage they're trying to inflict on you, then that's probably going to get you killed. Now the thing is, I understand what they're trying to go for here. They're trying to make it so you're the underdog, like you have barely any chance of success up until the very end where you finally actually do have a chance and hope is restored. But the problem is in the execution, and it's not even necessarily because of the individual mechanics I've just talked about. It's because of the save system. You only have two ways to save in this game. The first is at dedicated save points that are scattered around the maps, and they're pretty few and far between. The second is autosaves. That's right, there's no save anywhere option. In a game that's fairly open-ended in its level design and has numerous instances where you will go several minutes without a checkpoint. Now don't get me wrong, losing about 5 minutes of progress or so, mild annoyance, but you can deal with that. Losing closer to 20 minutes of progress, on the other hand, on a very regular basis because you keep dying when trying to infiltrate the outposts and such, is much more frustrating. Because remember, I've already said that getting into gunfights is generally a rather bad idea, which means you're going to be going off of the stealth mechanics most of the time. And as you might expect, sneaking around takes a lot longer than just running in and causing as much havoc as possible. So of course, this means you can sometimes go 10, 20, maybe even 30 minutes or more without hitting a checkpoint because you're trying to sneak around the various patrolling Terminators and such, and trying to to avoid the turrets or get up behind them and hack into them and all sorts of things like that. So you stand to lose quite a lot of progress if you get spotted and melted within the roughly second or so that it takes for the enemies to turn you into slag. This wouldn't be as much of a problem if the stealth mechanics were anything other than the most bare bones thing imaginable. The only really interesting thing they do with them is give you some goggles, which allow you to spot where the machines are even through walls, but it only goes up to a certain distance, and you move extremely slowly while they're equipped. And to make matters worse in that regard, you can't use any weapons or equipment while the goggles are on. You have to have the goggles off to be able to do any of that stuff. The only thing you can do while the goggles are on is move around and take pictures of things once you gain access to that ability a bit later on in the game. Other than the goggles, the stealth is really nothing more than, are you crouched? If so, you're in stealth. If not, you're not being stealthy. Nearly everything is based purely on line of sight mechanics. If you are within the enemy's line of sight, they can see you and your detection meter is going to start filling up until you get behind something substantial enough to actually block their field of vision. If it gets to the red, then the enemies will actually come over and start investigating your area, at which point they will probably find you and you will probably be dead. The only major exception to this rule is the silverfish, which I think mostly goes off of proximity rather than actual sound, because even though you can throw sound decoys to distract them, they don't seem to care much about gunfire or explosions, and they only get active once you get close enough to them. Thing is, they're the weakest enemies in the game, and they take basically one shot to bring down, so there's not really much point in not activating them and having them roll towards you and just mowing them down with a quick burst of gunfire. So your options for being stealthy are extremely limited, and in fact, the only weapon they give you that is actually useful in stealth is the termination knife, which requires you to get right behind a Terminator and press the left mouse button while it is equipped. It actually has to be equipped as a weapon, and then you can instantly take down that one Terminator at the cost of your termination knife, which are generally pretty expensive if you're buying them from the trade vendor, or you can craft them yourself, but they require quite a few components, and you don't gain access to that until a bit later on when you've gotten a few upgrades. Admittedly, they are pretty useful against the particularly tanky Terminators that dual-wield plasma rifles and can take an absolutely insane amount of punishment up until you gain access to those violet plasma weapons anyway, but they're still very situational weapons that you're never really going to have all that much access to, so you need to be careful with them, and you ultimately are going to find they're really not anywhere near as useful as they sound like they might be. So the stealth system ends up being quite weak, and if it was just an option, then that would be one thing, but it's really forced on the player more often than not, and that just makes it frustrating. And when you combine that with the gunplay, you find that while the game thematically makes a lot of sense, mechanically, it's just not very enjoyable at all. It just becomes a pretty subpar attempt at trying to ape the fairly generic modern action game formula, but stick a Terminator license on it. Everything it does was done better in other games, and when you look at the things it tries to do a bit differently, it doesn't really do them well enough to really matter all that much. I mean, for example, the weapon upgrade system is only available for the plasma weapons, and it consists of 3 slots that you can put chips into, and you can pick up these chips from the fallen Terminators and such. And for all of the rarities of chip except for the purple ones, you have to match the endings on the chips in order for the system to be functional, and you'll just end up getting some light bonuses to stability, damage, clip size, and fire rate, depending on which chips you choose. They don't really make all that much of a difference. Meanwhile, the weapon upgrades in a lot of these other games actually do make a pretty substantial difference, so it just ends up being really disappointing overall. Now don't get me wrong, this is certainly nowhere near as terrible as Teon's previous attempt at a licensed video game, which was Rambo the Video Game, and if you see my review of that, you know it was downright awful. And I wouldn't even go so far to say that Terminator Resistance is an outright bad game, but it is definitely subpar, and on my scale that puts it at a 2 out of 5. It's really the kind of game that only fans of the source material are really going to be able to put up with the shortcomings of in order to experience the things they want to get out of it. And it does have its moments, but they are so very few and far between that it just makes the overall experience hard to recommend at all. So maybe if you're a die-hard Terminator fan, you might want to pick this thing up when it's on sale for a really deep discount, but if you're just a first-person shooter fan or just a fan of action games and you wanted something to play, you can very safely avoid it. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting games for review, or equipment to help reviewing, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.